In the 20th century, historians revisited her life not for romance, but for the questions it raised still burning. How much pain can a system justify? When does abuse begin if it's legally sanctioned? And how do we remember those unheard today? Las Meninas is her strongest testament. Millions see it, few know its truth. In history books, her name is a footnote, yet her life shaped a century. Her marriage was a last attempt to save two empires, her death its quiet failure. Her daughter was the faint spark of a line long extinguished, and with her sank the ideal of royal purity into darkness. Some historians have tried to frame Margarita as a silent heroine, a dutiful royal martyr. But this misses the truth. She had no choice. She wasn't brave, she was broken. Her dignity lay not in enduring, but in the silence we can hear today, in every stifled breath, every smile she wasn't allowed to mean. She lives on in the memory of those who refuse to look away. Artists, writers, storytellers have rediscovered her in recent decades. Her story is retold as a warning, a call, a mirror, not just of monarchy, but of power itself, of structures that shape children before they can speak. What if Margarita lived today? Would we listen, protect her, or force her into another role, modern but no less confining? Perhaps a media star, perhaps a hidden victim, perhaps silent again. These questions are uncomfortable and vital. Margarita is not just history. She's present wherever young people are molded into roles they didn't choose, where girls must function for expectations, where systems outweigh humans. Her story shows progress is possible, but never guaranteed. Memory isn't a duty, it's a responsibility. Her short life of pain, control, and duty doesn't end with death. It ends with us, with whether we're willing to look at the suffering hidden behind golden frames and courtly rites. The grim beauty of her fate forces us to be honest about power sacrifice in our history. Perhaps that's Las Meninas. Deepest meaning, we don't just see, we recognize. We don't just view, we feel. Margarita was a figure in a courtly play, but Velázquez showed she was more. If an artist could do that in the 17th century, what stops us today? Imagine a child who never walked where she wished, a young woman who couldn't say no, an empress no one asked about her dreams, and a painting that captures it all in a moment for eternity. This isn't just history, it's an echo resonating today. Perhaps that's its power, a portal. Look closely and you see more than art, a stolen childhood, a life never hers, a gaze that asks across centuries. Do you see me now? Her silent look challenges us, showing not just a princess, but a child unheard, unasked, unprotected. A child who died before she could live. In school, she's barely mentioned. Before moving on, take a moment for Margarita the child. She was the woman she couldn't become, and all those trapped in her footsteps, yesterday, today, tomorrow. If we learn nothing from her story, the suffering doesn't just repeat, it becomes invisible. That's the true death. As archives open after centuries of silence, historians sift through letters, court records, and medical reports, revealing a chilling picture. Margarita was no anomaly, but part of a systematic machine. Her medical records read like livestock logs, her body measured, monitored, judged with no thought to her well-being. A 1672 physician's note coldly states, "Subject shows signs of reproductive exhaustion, yet still fertile. Subject not empress, not woman, not human." Such language reveals the system's dehumanization, how cruelty hides in courtly terms, religious duty or medical objectivity. The colder the words, the hotter the torment. But change stirs beyond the courts. Intellectuals and early feminists write of Margarita as a symbol of structural violence. Her story is woven into plays, poems, and quiet protests, becoming a face for the unheard. Her captivity sparks movement late but powerful. The dead admonish if we listen. Some artists create alternative images, Margarita not as a princess, but a rebel crown, torn, fist clenched, chest bared. These are fictions, but they hold truth, a longing to restore her dignity. What the system stole, others try to return, even if too late. Not all welcome this revival. Conservative voices accuse it of dramatizing history, claiming Margarita didn't suffer, that she fulfilled her duty. These arguments miss the power of historical structures. It's not about inventing feelings, but recognizing context. Saying she complied ignores her silence, mistaking lack of protest for consent. We don't know what Margarita thought. Her letters are lost or destroyed. Perhaps she never spoke openly, dared not, or couldn't imagine another life. That's the insidiousness of such systems. They don't just cause pain, they erase alternatives. The prison isn't just walls, but thoughts. When we speak of Margarita today, we speak of all who couldn't raise their voices, victims of invisible violence, children turned into tools. We speak of the living's duty to give the dead justice, not through vengeance, but memory. Memory doesn't heal, but it prevents repetition. Margarita was sacrificed because no one stopped what all knew, because power trumped compassion, because systems can devour humans if unquestioned. Her death wasn't chance, it was consequence avoidable, making it both painful and profound. In every golden frame, royal portrait or grand ceremony, a shadow may lurk. Margarita is that shadow, gentle, silent, unforgettable. Speaking of her today isn't martyrdom, but a warning. Even the grandest crown is worthless if it rests on a broken life. She remains not just in the Prado, but in our minds, not as a historical figure, but a mirror asking, what are you willing to sacrifice for status or power? What's missing often says more than what's written. Her silence screams, and we must hear it. In a world where power structures persist in new guises, her story is more relevant than ever. Whether in palaces or modern institutions, wherever young lives are shaped to serve expectations, not dreams, her fate endures. Margarita isn't just past. She's the echo of every unseen childhood, every lost possibility. The question isn't what happened to her, but what we do with it. Do we let her rest in books as a footnote, or take her seriously as a warning, a moral responsibility? Margarita was a victim not just of the Habsburgs, but of a mindset that survives that systems matter more than individuals, that ends justify means that suffering is tolerable if hidden, but her image remains visible. With every glance at Las Meninas, we remember not her crown, but her humanity, the child behind the splendor, the tears no record mentioned, the hope her story isn't just told, but understood. Only that can prevent its repetition. Next time you're in a museum, pause, look closely. Behind every face in oil lies a life, sometimes tragic, sometimes silent, sometimes like Margarita's beautifully painted, but steeped in pain. Art can't save us, but it can awaken us. In the irony of fate, there's solace. Margarita, never heard in life, speaks today, across centuries, not through her words, but our recognition. Her story is more than a historical curiosity. It's a test of our compassion, our ability to not just see, but feel, not just learn, but act. In Las Meninas, she's frozen in gold light and gaze a child unaware of what's to come. Yet something in her face hints at knowledge, a trace of foreboding. Perhaps she sensed her life wouldn't be hers. And perhaps Velázquez saw it too, not just a model, but a fate. Not just beauty, but truth. We today carry that truth forward with every retelling, every remembrance, every effort to make the invisible visible. Margarita was sacrificed, but her sacrifice wasn't in vain if we learn from it. History doesn't just give answers. It asks questions, some burning. What's a life worth? When does exploitation begin? Who protects the voiceless? Margarita is gone, but her story lives, reminding us recognizing injustice isn't enough. We must name it. Regret isn't enough, we must change. And sometimes it starts with a glance at a painting. If you've listened this far, thank you. You've broken her silence with your attention. You've seen what many overlook. Perhaps you'll carry a spark of her story forward. If you feel such stories must be heard, subscribe, share, and leave your thoughts. Memory needs community, and Margarita Theresa deserves to be remembered not as a victim, but as a human. It was like dousing a burning house with perfume. Leopold remarried, this time to Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg. She too bore children quickly, and they too were weak and sickly. One Joseph Thurm later became emperor, but his life was plagued by illness, his marriage childless. The Habsburg line crumbled slowly but inexorably. The Habsburgs had dehumanized their line for generations. Children became objects, women breeding vessels, love contracts. Their obsession with purity was their undoing, and Margarita was its perfect symbol. Beautiful young sacrificed, not despite her royal origins, but because of them. After her death, Margarita was not remembered for her deeds or thoughts. Her name faded from official chronicles, too painful, too useless. Yet something endured her image. Velázquez's Las Meninas. Painted when she was 5 became a masterpiece of art history. Millions viewed it without knowing her story. They saw a princess, not a victim. But the painting is more than art, it's a silent scream. Velázquez showed her not as a puppet, but as a human. Her gaze fixed on us carries a premonition of what was to come. Framed and trapped among court ladies and symbols of power, she stands alone, captured in a moment that was her only taste of freedom. Before it control, after it death. Modern art historians read Las Meninas as a critique of monarchy power and what we call princesses. It's not a portrait of a happy childhood, but a quiet record of a lost future. The composition, light, and space all isolate Margarita. She's central, yet excluded, surrounded by courtiers but unprotected. Today, the painting hangs in Madrid's Prado Museum. Tourists snap photos, children rush by. Few know what lies behind the golden hair. Few know this child was promised to her uncle at 11, married at 14, lost her first child at 15, and died at 21 with no one to mourn her. This painting is both a monument and an accusation. Margarita Theresa stands not alone, but for countless women in history whose bodies were currency, whose lives weren't theirs, whose wills were broken before they could form. Her eyes reflect not just her story, but our question: how many Margaritas were there? And how many are there still? Perhaps her legacy is not royal, but human. She reminds us that systems prioritizing power over humanity always fail, that no blood is pure enough to justify a life, and that a painting can say more than any crown. In Las Meninas, she lives on, not as an empress, but as a child free one last time. In the shadow of her death, the Habsburgs began rethinking their strategy, not out of compassion, but necessity. The genetic catastrophe was undeniable. Yet instead of ending inbreeding, they sought medical fixes, strengthening elixirs, astrological marriage timings, prayer chains against miscarriages. And what will you do when you see someone sacrifice? Margarita can't answer, but we can through our actions and words. Her final traces in the archives are cold: death date, cause, burial protocol. No mention of feelings, no word of her loneliness. Yet we sense her between the lines in history's breaths. Margarita's name was rarely mentioned. Only the walls whispered of her, but not all forgot her. A court lady's private note found later read, "The Empress died quietly. No one heard her call. Perhaps because no one listened." This unnamed woman also noted that Margarita wore a small locket with her mother's image, until the end, perhaps her last shred of comfort in the cold court. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers took interest in such women's fates. Margarita became a symbol of how systems dehumanize. Her life was a case study in moral degradation, not out of pity, but as proof that power corrupts, tradition can kill, and blood guarantees no dignity. French philosopher Marquis de Condorcet wrote, "When an empire sacrifices children to sustain itself, it has long lost its right to rule." He cited Margarita the princess, who was never allowed to be a child. Her story became a torch for reforms in marriage laws, education, and women's autonomy. Her suffering was not in vain, yet tragically, she knew none of this. Reports of her final days say she often gazed westward towards Spain, singing childhood songs so softly they were barely audible. A court lady wrote, "It sounded like a prayer or a farewell." Perhaps Margarita hoped for freedom in another life, or perhaps she had stopped hoping. Her daughter Maria Antonia, left at the Viennese court, was soon made a political bride. The cycle began anew: marriage, pregnancy, illness. She died at 23, exhausted and alone, leaving one child who was swept into the Spanish succession wars. The ghosts of the past never left the family. It was as if Margarita had left a curse, not out of malice, but as a consequence. The system that destroyed her destroyed itself. Every attempt to control through marriage brought more suffering, loss, and decay, until the notion of divine bloodlines became laughable. Margarita didn't topple the system, but she exposed it. In one of the most magnificent paintings in art history, Velázquez's Las Meninas, a blonde girl with solemn eyes gazes at us. But what if I told you this child, celebrated as a symbol of royal beauty, was forced into a marriage with her own uncle and died at 21, exhausted by 5 pregnancies and a dynasty that valued her blood over her life? This is not a princess's fairy tale, but her nightmare. If you're ready to uncover the darkest truth behind royal splendor, subscribe to our channel and join us on a journey through the disturbing fate of Margarita Theresa. What you're about to hear will stay with you. Madrid, mid-17th century. The Habsburgs rule a crumbling empire, outward pomp and ceremony, inward disease and decadence. In this world, Margarita Theresa is born the child of a niece-uncle marriage. Her fate is sealed at birth. She is to cement the bond between two inbred royal houses. Even in the nursery, her smile isn't admired, but her potential fertility is. She is not a daughter, not a child, but a diplomatic pawn. Her father, Philip IV of Spain, was a broken man aged by war scandals and the slow collapse of his empire. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, was brought from Vienna at 14 to marry her own uncle, a child sacrificed to an aging king. And now this child would lead her own daughter to the same fate. What she felt remains unspoken, but the silence speaks volumes. As a baby, Margarita was surrounded by courtiers who judged her like a prized animal. How is she growing? Is her skin pale enough? Does she bear the distinctive Habsburg features? Court physicians regularly examined her physical development, not out of care, but to ensure she'd be ripe enough to bear as many heirs as possible. At just 9 years old, she underwent her first gynecological exam, a practice even many contemporaries secretly found cruel. Her upbringing was anything but childlike. Margarita learned no songs or games, but Latin court protocol and the perfect curtsy. She was forbidden from forming friendships or expressing desires. Even her favorite color was discouraged. Red was deemed too bold. Instead, she learned to smile, quietly pray, and submit, for obedience was the greatest virtue of a future empress, especially one destined to marry her uncle. Yet amidst the gilded walls and rigid etiquette, there were fleeting moments of light. Margarita loved painting, one of the few joys allowed her. Velázquez, the royal court painter, noticed her intelligence and the quiet sadness in her eyes. In Las Meninas, he captured her not as a bride or an object, but as a human, a child. Perhaps it was his silent protest against what awaited her. Perhaps he knew more than he revealed. Behind the scenes, the political chess game began. The Spanish and Austrian courts planned her marriage to Leopold I, her mother's brother and thus her uncle. Margarita was only 11. The letters exchanged between Madrid and Vienna spoke not of love or maturity, but of dowry, bloodline, and dynastic necessity. The girl was traded like a treasure, except this treasure had a heart that was quietly breaking. At 14, she was married by proxy, without her groom present, a doll, in a lavish dress reciting vows she didn't understand. Her wedding night would follow months later in Vienna once she was safely delivered. The journey was a macabre spectacle. In every town she passed through, she was displayed like a trophy, and everyone knew this girl was not honored, but sacrificed. Upon arriving in Vienna, she found no affection, only a system. Court ladies monitored her every move. Physicians inspected her fertility again, while Leopold XXVI treated her kindly but distantly. Whether he felt pity is unclear. He too was a cog in the dynastic machine. Margarita, now officially an empress, knew her role: to bear children and, if possible, survive. Just 3 months after her arrival, her first pregnancy was announced. She was barely 15. The court rejoiced, she wept. No one asked if she was ready. Instead, her daily routine was controlled even more strictly, every meal documented, every step analyzed. Her body became state property, the life within her a project of national importance. But what no one foresaw, her first child would never see the light of day. In the 7th month, Margarita suffered a miscarriage. The court responded with medical routine: no pause, no mourning, just a quiet note in the records. Accident, but still fertile. Physicians prescribed leeches, herbal concoctions, and absolute bed rest, not to heal her soul, but to ensure she could conceive again soon. Her body was wounded, but the system pressed on. Months later, she was pregnant again. The treatment was even harsher: forced rest and absurd dietary restrictions that further weakened her. She lost this child too, a stillborn girl, in November. Margarita no longer cried aloud. Her pain had frozen within her. Her letters to her mother, if they ever existed, were never published. Perhaps they revealed too much. In January 1670, her daughter Maria Antonia was born, the first child to survive. The court called it a miracle, but the true miracle was that Margarita was still alive. Her health was already shattered, yet the pressure to produce a male heir intensified. Even at her bedside, discussions swirled about when she could conceive again. Her daughter was not a cause for joy, but a partial success. Over the next 2 years, 2 more pregnancies followed, both ending in miscarriages. Margarita was often ill-suffering, feigning spells, bleeding, and fevers. Court physicians diagnosed hysterical weakness, but no diagnosis was used to ease her burden. Instead, the pressure mounted. The Spanish succession was uncertain. Her half-brother Charles II was deemed incapable of producing heirs. It fell to Margarita to save the dynasty. Leopold, torn between concern and duty, was described in chronicles as caring for her. But care was no shield against a system that sacrificed lives for power. He held her hand while others judged her womb. Perhaps he even loved her, but love was irrelevant in this game. Margarita was the bridge between 2 empires, and that bridge could not collapse no matter the cost. In 1672, Margarita became pregnant for the 5th time. Her body was already exhausted, but she was forced to continue. Physicians noted persistent bleeding, chronic pain, and suspected infections, yet no one halted the process. A new heir was too valuable to abandon. Margarita was isolated, controlled, treated like a machine, not a human. Her eyes, reports say, were empty. By autumn 1672, it was clear neither she nor the child would survive. Her skin was gray, her limbs trembled. Even the sternest court ladies whispered she looked like a ghost. Yet the hope for a male heir kept the machinery running. Leopold spent nights by her bed, desperate and helpless. Margarita no longer prayed, only silence remained. She knew death was near, and no one would stop it. On March 12, 1673, in the cold early morning, labor began. The birth was horrific hours of agony, blood, and screams. The child, a boy, was stillborn. Margarita followed him hours later. She was 21. Her death was not a tragedy, but a calculation, a foreseen loss in a dynastic experiment where only results mattered. And Margarita had failed. Barely was her body cold when new negotiations began. Leopold had to remarry. Physicians debated how long he should wait. Diplomats proposed new names. The mourning was performative, the funeral lavish and ostentatious, not for her, but for prestige. Margarita was buried in a gilded coffin, surrounded by incense choirs and hollow condolences. No word of her suffering, only political eulogies. Spain reacted similarly, no national mourning, no tribute, just a report to the king. The alliance has failed. New options are being considered. The woman once called a crown jewel was now a footnote. Her daughter Maria Antonia was left behind and would face a similar fate years later. The Habsburgs had bought time, but at what cost? Maria Antonia, Margarita's only surviving child, was molded into a bride for the system, not a daughter to a human. At 15, she was married to Maximilian, Elector of Bavaria. She too became pregnant early and suffered miscarriages. Her body was frail, her spirit quiet. Her surviving letters show the same resigned politeness, the same wish to simply exist without expectations. But the Habsburg legacy clung to her. Her only child, Joseph Ferdinand, was sickly, a result of inherited degeneration. His early years were marked by illness, treated blindly by Habsburg physicians with leeches, fumigations, and cold water. When he died, Antonia was not surprised, only weary. She followed him a few years later, another young woman worn out by dynastic hopes that never materialized. Meanwhile, the Spanish Habsburg Empire neared collapse. King Charles II, Margarita's half-brother, was severely deformed, unable to rule or produce an heir. His jaw was so malformed he could barely speak. He suffered epileptic seizures, mental instability, and chronic weakness, a biological consequence of centuries of inbreeding, the final stop on the dynasty's decline. Margarita Theresa's death was thus no isolated tragedy, but part of a collective downfall.